Russia is responding to the strikes, calling them lawless and irresponsible. They have warned that there will be consequences from what took place. BBC Kiev correspondent Jonah Fisher joins us now from Moscow to talk about what that might look like. Jonah, what has been the reaction from the Russian government at this stage?
Well, if we just look at what people have been saying here within the government, there's been a pretty angry response first thing this morning, and we had the Russian ambassador to the United States saying some pretty strong things. Then Vladimir Putin, the Russian president himself, put out a statement. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of what he said this morning, he called the strikes an act of aggression against a sovereign state. He talked about the attacks indulging terrorists, and that the actions by the United States further exacerbates the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria, who suffer, and it's the civilian population who suffer. I think we do have to separate out what people are saying here to what perhaps they're feeling behind closed doors. Remember, in the run-up to these strikes, there was considerable concern about the possibility of a military contact between the United States and the Russian forces that are on the ground in Syria. There's a considerable Russian presence there. There's a Russian Navy base. That did not come to pass. There was no military contact between the United States and Russia. Indeed, the Russians say they didn't fire their anti-missile systems overnight in response to the strikes. So while we've had perhaps the predictable calls of outrage that this is an insult and that this shouldn't have happened, I think behind closed doors here, people are relieved to a certain extent. One, that the strikes were quite limited in their scope, and secondly, that there was no contact with the primarily American strike, which would have put pressure on Russia to respond.
And Jonah, we are seeing each government at this stage put their own spin on what's taken place. But what about reaction from just citizens there in Moscow where you are? What do they think of what's taken place?
I think you have to bear in mind when you talk about the reaction of people here in Russia as to what they've been told in the run-up to the events over the last several weeks, because remember, there's also been this story of the Skripal, the spy poisoning in the United Kingdom, which has been on the news quite a lot here. Russian TV has been feeding a pretty strong narrative to people here that this is a conspiracy by the West, that these have been set up by the West, by Western intelligence services, to make Russia look bad. I think if you go out and talk to people here, there are many people who will repeat what they're being told by the main TV channels here, that there is a Western conspiracy against Russia aimed at making everything Russia do outside the borders here look bad.
Now, Russia's called this strike an act of aggression. Our analysts are saying that Russia is unlikely to want to go toe-to-toe militarily with the United States. But the Russian ambassador says these actions won't be left without some type of consequences. What might those consequences be? Could it be some form of harassment in the region? What might they do?
I think we have to put that phrase, consequences, in the context of what we've seen since then. Yes, a rather ambiguous phrase from the Russian ambassador that could seem pretty sinister if you just leave it out there. But I think in everything that we've seen since then, the fact that Russia has moved to have discussions at the United Nations Security Council, the fact that we've had Vladimir Putin come out and say something, it means we're unlikely to see anything military in response to this. That's what obviously was the main concern initially, that there might be some sort of military response for the Russian. I think that has gone off the table in part because this was so limited. The strikes were targeted primarily at chemical weapons institutions and things related to chemical weapons production, and that there was no military contact. That, I think, has taken the most scary consequences, if you like, off the table for now.
Now, Russia claims they deflected missiles shot at Syria, but one question may be that Syria turns to Russia and says, you know, why are you here if you're not defending our assets? What do you make of what these strikes and the tempered Russian response might do to Russian-Syrian relations?
Well, if you listen to the briefings coming out of the Pentagon and you compare them with what the Russians are saying here, well, they are completely different stories of what happened last night. That Pentagon briefing that happened a short while ago, they said that no Syrian weapon that had been fired had had any impact on anything which the Americans had done overnight. Here this morning, the Ministry of Defense came out and said of the more than 100 missiles which had been fired towards Syria overnight, more than 70 of them had been intercepted by the Syrian military, not the Russian military, but by the Syrian military, and we're painting that as something of a success. So two very different narratives from the pictures that are coming in of the different chemical weapons institutions and chemical weapons facilities. It does seem that the weapons have, for the most part, hit their targets in Syria, but Russia is still sticking to its line that a large proportion of those missiles were actually taken out by the Syrian defense systems.
And we'll wait and see as more images and video come in showing the full aftermath of these strikes. Jonah Fisher, thanks very much for joining us from Moscow.